Hello, everyone. Once more, we're here doing something a little different. Today, I'm very excited because we're going to be talking about pre-code horror comics, which I know is pretty niche, but in my opinion, very, very exciting. I am here with Adam Fortier, who is the head of publishing at Macroverse, who they're doing something really exciting with Golden Age horror comic restorations. So thank you so much for coming and taking the time to talk to me about this, because when I got an email about like we're doing this Kickstarter for these horror age like pre-code 15 comics, I just found it incredibly fascinating. So how did you decide to try and restore these horror, like these golden age horror comics?
Well, it's part of a line that we're calling authentic editions, and
Hmm.
honestly, we had to find a place to start. We had been working on the technology for a few years, for various reasons, and really, it was just the idea of bringing books to people who otherwise would never have a chance to experience them. We all know the classics like Action Comics #1, first appearance Superman, Amazing Fantasy 15, first appearance Spider-Man, and so that's kind of where the idea originated. Because there's a few people who own these books, and everybody else kind of gets to read these facsimiles. But in many respects, the facsimiles are shortened, they're recolored, they're redrawn, they're resized, and so it doesn't actually give you the feel of the original book, which to me is kind of the original artist's intent. You know,
Hmm.
it'd be like having a debate over what Leonardo da Vinci could do with a computer, and it's like, well, sure, but he couldn't do anything because he's dead. So he did what he did the Mona Lisa with what he had, and that is
Hmm.
his vision. And so to me, when you go back to the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s with the particular way of printing, the particular way of how they source the paper, how they distribute it, that was the original intention for these books, these stories, a lot of things that really affect us day to day nowadays.
Hmm.
And so I just wanted people to experience what it was like back then. We decided to start with pre-code horror because honestly, pre-code horror is pretty fun
Yeah.
and just wacky. Like there were no railings on it. Um, you know, and so it's just some of it's kind of like a fever dream, and it's just a lot of fun to see what they were thinking like 80 years ago.
I have seen like around that there are some people who do kind of do facsimiles, like you were saying, of these older works, even of the pre-code stuff. But a lot of it
Mhm.
is just, scanning what's available or those kind of things. And lots of times they're not always of the highest quality. So what are you doing that's different? Because I was really impressed when I saw the like preview pages for the authentic edition. So how did you get them to look like that?
Well, some of that is a special technology developed, and some of it's black magic. So, I can't speak too much about it, but I can tell you kind of like some of the fundamental differences. We're
Hmm.
using the original print process. So, back in the 1940s and 1950s, there were no colorists, so to speak. When you were a penciler or when you were an inker, this is what you did, and then you actually sent it off to the printer with just
Hmm.
little notes going, this is red, this is blue, this is white, and the printer was responsible for setting the colors. um, this started out in the 1940s, and as they realized how popular comics were becoming, they wanted to kind of play around with it some, and they wanted to figure out how to make it better and better and better. So that's when you started getting collaborations. But when you're talking about the fundamental difference between facsimiles that are being done now and the
Hmm.
facsimiles that we're doing, we're actually duplicating the coloring process, whereas most of these facsimiles are again just photos or just scans or
Digital
um,
like retouches, those kind of things.
yeah, and I don't have any animosity towards people who are doing that. And when you go to Marvel Masterworks, all of that stuff is being recolored
Hmm.
and everything like that. Most of it is necessary because they don't have the original print files. The original print plates were made out of metal,
Hmm.
um, and so they were recycled very quickly.
Hmm.
Um, but we have been able to duplicate that process, and it creates kind of like an almost optical illusion. So when you look at kind of one of the facsimiles that are being done versus the originals or our versions, it's actually night and day, honestly.
Hmm.
It has a depth to it that I don't think you get nowadays.
I think I would agree with that because I love to go back and look at some of the older stuff. And I'm always excited when there's a facsimile of something because of that accessibility element. Because lots of times when you're going and you're looking, especially when you've gone as far back and into the genre that you've gone into, a lot of times if you're looking up one of these books, the first thing you'll find is, like, oh, how much it costs or like, how much it's worth. But very rarely will it be what was in it. And so
Hmm.
sometimes I feel like those elements can be lost. So I think it's really important to bring that kind of history forward because there's a whole bunch of artists and writers and people who started during this era who it's almost like that part of them is kind of cut off because you don't see all of it because horror was cut off at the knees with the code and all of that stuff. And like horror used to be huge and there was so much of it. So how did you decide which ones you wanted to pull from?
Hmm. Hmm. Well, our the easiest method that we started with was we looked at the most valuable stuff,
Mhm.
because that's the stuff that people are most interested in.
Mhm.
And so we started there, and then we kind of like pick and choose the series a little bit and honed in. Another thing that we're doing that I think is fundamentally different is a lot of times you'll see facsimiles of the most popular books,
Mhm.
but then that kind of eschews all the other stuff. Punch Comics, there's a really great skull cover, Punch Comics number 12, but that series went on for 26 issues. And
Mhm.
so we kind of forget or don't have the opportunity to see a lot of the other stuff that to me is just as amazing as the keys. But people don't make facsimiles of it because it doesn't sell 20,000 copies.
What's your favorite of the ones that you picked for the first 15?
I'd say Punch Comics number 12. Like that
Mhm.
was a really like significant one to me. I just saw that and visually it was just so striking. Probably our second favorite is the Chamber of Chills 19, the one with the
Yeah.
goblet, and like that's just classic. But yeah, it's honestly really hard. There's really good points to all of them. Like the
Yeah.
Black Widow spider with the skull head, like that gives me nightmares still. Like it's creepy. So it's very very cool for that, and I think that one of the things that I think that we don't think a lot about nowadays is that the horror scene really happened in like the mid to late 1940s and the 1950s, and that was in large part a response to the popularity of comics in the late 1930s and early 1940s and World
Mhm.
War II.
Mhm.
You had teenagers and you had people in their 20s going away to war. They came back, and suddenly these kind of like upbeat, optimistic comics just didn't serve them anymore as they got older and everything like that. So I
Mhm.
think that the horror comics is, in a way, a response to that.
No, it's
Um,
very interesting because that's the era when you start to see superhero popularity decline. And
yep.
then it comes back in the mid to late 50s after they implement the code. And pretty much based on what they've done with the changes to the titles and what you can and can't do, it really doesn't allow for a lot of the things that were happening inside these books, although I have to say the covers oftentimes go a bit harder than the
Hmm.
inside for a lot of them. Like, not that the stories themselves can't go to some places, but the covers are where some of them really show off their artistry of just how much they can kind of put forward in at least the
Hmm.
tone of what they're doing.
Yeah, the comics code was not a good thing to have happen, but having looked through all of these books, I
Mhm.
can see what they were saying in some cases. There's some
It's one
really
of
bad
those
stories in there.
things. That's one of the reasons I'm so excited to see these things coming back because it's very easy when you haven't read the stuff to just look at the general moral panic and the Senate hearings and read those things and Frederick Wortham's seduction of the innocent and all those things. But then when you look at some of what's going on inside of the actual books at the time, if you're able to find them, you're like, it didn't come entirely out of nowhere. Like some of these things are going
Hmm.
a little hard. So
Yeah, exactly. We always have these dialogues about Dungeons Dragons, video games, comic books. It's always about these things, and I think we tend to have absolute arguments about them, like is
mhm,
it okay versus is it not okay versus no real discussion about degrees. But having
mhm.
been involved in Dungeons Dragons and video games and comic books, I'm
Yeah.
like, there's some points, there's some valid points being made. I'm gonna be honest here.
How did you go about obtaining these issues? Like, did you get the original issues for this?
Yeah, we did. And that's in part to ensure that it's as authentic as it can be.
Hmm.
Whenever you're dealing with files, scans, things like that, you have a barrier between the original and the file, and it's filtered by an individual who took those photos. In
Hmm.
many cases, the facsimiles are based upon, like Xerox photocopies that are like maybe 72 or 150 DPI,
Hmm.
um, which stands for dots per inch. And kind of the better DPI you have, the more detailed your imagery is. But a lot of these photos were taken when the books were like, oh, this is a $300 book, and you want to be careful. But now, when you're dealing with books that are like $100,000, there's nobody
Hmm.
who really wants to like tear that thing open and do
Yeah.
another photocopy set, just to get kind of like better resolution. So it's something we had to do ourselves.
What are your plans for going forward? Because you said like this is just the start of what you want to do. So like how do you
Mhm.
are you planning to maybe do all of the lines? Like what are you hoping for?
Yeah, so we actually have a couple licenses right now, and one I've already talked about, and I've gotten in trouble for talking about it. But I'm like, I already said it, so I can say that Archie is going to be our next one.
Hmm.
And I'm really excited about that one as well. And then we're again, going to be doing some other ones. The other licenses I can't really talk about, but
Hmm.
I think the plan is kind of like every month to have a little fun with this stuff and to show people something that connects to them.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Do you think you'll ever dive into the wild world of classic romance comics?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. No, 100%. Because there's a lot of like really famous artists and writers that came
Hmm.
from romance, much like horror. In
Hmm.
this series, there's actually some Stan Lee writing.
Hmm.
Of course, there's Schoenberg covers or L.B. Cole covers, but like there's a lot of popularity there. Kirby did some romance books and everything like that, and I absolutely
Hmm.
love the crap out of them as well.
I saw in some of these that I know that Carmine Infantino did some of the art inside of some of these like
Hmm.
early like some so you get to see people evolve over time and that's really really cool. So what's your favorite part about diving into the history of comics? Like what drew you to it?
Well, I've always been a comic book fan.
Mhm.
My grandfather would buy me Archie. He'd buy me Disney. Of course, he'd buy me DC and Marvel and everything. But
Mhm.
it really just, as a pre-teenager, I had the benefit of just reading anything that I wanted whenever I wanted it, and that drove me to comics initially. Um, but I love the historical nature of comics because to me, it's almost a real time representation of what's going on in the world in an
Mhm.
artistic way. When you have movies, when you have TV, there's all this like build in time, and there's all these things being done to tweak it here and tweak it there. With comic books, it was such a rapid pace, and it was month after month after month. When
Mhm.
something didn't work, it was a quick pivot, and when something did work, they went hard in it. And so when you read these on a month to month basis, it really lets you know where the world is in a real way.
When you're looking back at these and you compare it to the horror of today, like do you see the seeds in from or do you feel that bit of disconnect because some of these things have been, kind of forgotten? Because like I was looking at, for example, I know Oni Press is bringing back EC. And
Mhm.
so they're playing around with that kind of format. And I find it very interesting to go and compare the new, kind of EC fare to
Mhm.
the older kind of horror comics fare. Do you ever do that?
Yeah, and I definitely see, some of the good starting place. I mean, to me, one of the fun reason, like, I love the fact that we live in a world of memes now that
Yeah.
are often derived from movies, TV, and books that people no longer understand the references to. And
Hmm.
so these memes, exist in their own bubble, and it's really
Hmm.
kind of cool to see where they started from. You talk about EC, and EC was the first one to do the Crypt Keeper, and I bet you the majority of the population knows the Crypt Keeper, but doesn't know where he came from. Is a
Hmm.
good example.
Hmm.
Yeah. So to me, that's kind of like the fun nature of it. You can just like see those originations, but absolutely for this stuff from the 1940s and 1950s. it doesn't apply in the exact same way as right now because we're used to something different. But a lot of these things are more H.P. Lovecraft, they're more Alfred Hitchcock than they are like Saw.
What do you think that people who go and pick these up will be surprised by? I love your mug, by the way.
No, thank you so much. I think that they will be most surprised by the sophistication of the stories. I think
Mhm.
that there there really is this sense of, well, you know, comics were for kids for such a long period of time, and for sure in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s we largely just think about comics for kids, superhero comics, Archie,
Mhm.
Disney, you know, outsold Marvel and DC in the
Mhm.
1950s and 1940s. And so we just have that connection to, oh, they're for kids. When you see this stuff, you realize that there's a lot more depth to the stories that existed, and there's a lot of, you know, fare that was for adults. You know,
Mhm.
we think about it in the underground comics movement as really that push for like adult comics, and I'm like, no, no, that actually happened decades ago. You can see
Mhm.
that in Suspense comics and Punch comics right now.
Do you think that they were really aiming for an older audience, or do you think that the perception of what children could handle was a bit different?
No, I think they're aiming for an older audience. I think that it was when, to me and to my mind, when World War II ended, it was really kind of like a very clear delineation. You know, the bad guys lost, the good guys won. You know, that was very much the perception of the time. And again, you had people in their teens, in their 20s, you know, going to another continent, you know, being put on the line with a gun, you know, being told to kill people. I mean,
Mhm.
there's a lot of horrors that come from that,
Mhm.
and you're expected to grow up a lot quicker than I think that we're expected to grow up today as a result of that. And
Mhm.
so I think that these stories are a response to that. You know, nowadays a 22-year-old probably wouldn't be reading what a 22-year-old in the 1940s or 1950s would have read. So yeah, that's what I think, but I might be wrong because we're kind of supposing all of this stuff.
Well, that's one of the exciting things is when things like this happen, you can see how newer generations respond to it.
Mhm.
And so for the Kickstarter, so let's go into the details about that a little bit. Like
Absolutely.
what's that going to entail basically?
Yeah, so we have the base version of the Kickstarter, which is, as you know, the Frightening 15, which are kind of like the 15 most iconic covers. Another personal favorite is Punch 9, where the artist is over his table and his drawings have come to life and are killing
Mhm.
him in various ways.
Mhm.
Um, so you get to experience those. You get to experience the entirety of the comics because I believe fundamentally comics were designed to be read, not, you know, treated as a piece of art and hung up on our wall.
Mhm.
So it's important for us that you read those. Another cool part of it is we are actually going to be distributing them in collectible boxes as well, with the idea that you can literally just take the box, you can put it up there, up on a shelf, you can open it up and read it whenever you like. Um, because another problem to me with comic books is they've become so collectible that we stick them in a box and we stick them away, and it
Mhm.
doesn't give us that opportunity to enjoy them, you know, organically. So you have those 15. We do sell complete runs of Suspense, of Punch, of Chamber of Chills, and of Weird Mysteries. And
Mhm.
so that's kind of like the next tier down that you could choose. Like, okay, I just want all the Chamber of Chills, you know,
Mhm.
or I just want all the Weird Mysteries, and you'll be able to experience those. I really believe that some of those covers still stand the test of time. You know,
Mhm.
you put them up against the 15 covers and they're just as beautiful. I just think that people had a choice of like, hey, what's my favorite cover?
Yeah.
And they weren't able to choose the top
Yeah.
30 or 40. So we have that. And then we also have different foil treatments. We have a red foil treatment, a silver foil treatment. All of these are just for the 15. We didn't want to do it for all the other ones because that would have been
Mhm.
kind of
A lot.
egregious, shall we say. Yeah. We're also doing really cool fluorescent ones. And because of the coloring style back in the time, it was a limited color palette. It was, again, printed in a particular manner. The fluorescents are really going to hit hard. Like, it's just, they're beautiful. It was like designed for it. So, those are kind of the different offerings that we have. And you can go in and participate as little or as much as you like.
No, I think it's really exciting, and I totally agree with what you were saying about I believe comics need to be read as well. And
Mhm.
as I mean, I have a bunch behind me. I like collecting too, but I think it's important also to experience them. There's something that's a bit lost if they just end up sitting somewhere and not read. And I think
Mhm.
there's still a lot of value in these older stories. And I think that they can perhaps inspire like an entire new generation of people who are not familiar with some of the things they're seeing inside of them, like certain particular maybe tropes or turns of phrase. And like when you go back and look at the old pulps and the like, there's just still so
Mhm.
much of value in there to be found. So what do you think is your like favorite bit of the in terms of writing style for how they do that?
Ooh, that's a good question. So my favorite series of all of these, I would have to say, is probably Chamber of Chills.
Mhm.
It's in the 1950s, whereas Suspense and Punch are in the 1940s, and so it feels somewhat different. Like it's not always a straight horror story. Sometimes it's more suspense, sometimes it's more crime and action. Sometimes it's horror. Whereas Chamber of Chills is horror,
Mhm.
and that's what they do. And they really lean into it, and they really kind of take it to the next level. And so when you have a zombie story, it's kind of extra creepy because there's not there hasn't been like dozens of zombie stories told and dozens of movies and dozens of TV shows. So in
Mhm.
a lot of instances, these are kind of like some of the first representations or some of the early representations of what we think as like really common genres now. So it's kind of fun to go through and to read those and really get that sense of like these were people that were pushing the envelope. These were people that originated the idea. It's like reading um, Bram Stoker's Dracula, where it's like we all know vampires now, but that was the start. That was
Mhm.
the beginning, and so it's kind of extra cool for that.
Yeah, because you kind of get to see some of the tropes begin to find their footing. And so it's like some of the things that we're now super familiar with or twists that may read as entirely obvious. It's always important to go back and put yourself into like the headspace of the time and think, like, well, how obvious would this have been back then? Or was this something brand new? And I think that's something really exciting, at least for me. I like to try and put myself into the headspace of what it would have been like to read it at the time, which sometimes can be difficult, but it can also give you a different level of enjoyment to it. Like, I don't know, I wouldn't know if it's intellectual or how I would describe it, but it's just different.
Well, it really it just you know when we talk about older stories no longer having the value that stories today have. I think we're ignoring things like Lord of the Rings. I think we're ignoring things like H.P. Lovecraft, like
Mhm,
Sherlock Holmes, like all of these. We can see a clear delineation from where they started and where they are now. This ignores, Superman and Batman and Captain America
mhm.
and all of these people. It's the same thing where I'm like, nobody says, can you get me the abridged Lord of the Rings? You want the original Lord of the Rings. You want to see where the movies came from, where the TV shows come from. You want to delve into and see like where those favorite scenes started from and everything like that. And that's comics to me.
What is your ultimate hope for this project?
My ultimate hope for this project is just to create something that stands the test of time. The other element that we really don't talk about as much in comics are comics is a collectible that deteriorates daily. These
Mhm,
were created on newsprint papers that were created out of wood pulp, which actually has acid built into it. So all of these books are decaying, and there's
mhm,
nothing we can do to stop that. And it's probably not today, and it's probably not tomorrow, but there's
mhm,
going to be a point in time when these books simply will not exist in the current manner.
mhm,
And to be able to digitize these, to be able to reprint them in an authentic way,
mhm,
to me, allows that bridge of history to still exist instead of disappear forever.
mhm. I think that preservation is so important to not lose the beginnings of where things came from. Like, I'm personally very passionate about that. Like, whenever I hear stories about,
Mhm.
like old Doctor Who tapes being recorded over or anything, whatever it is, it's just always like, no. But it just feels like something is being lost. So that's part of why I was so excited to see this, because I do feel that even though they are comics and they are a form of entertainment, I do feel like they become part of the culture. And it's like you were talking earlier about like the memes and how, sometimes people are repeating or saying things and they go to look for them and they might not maybe one day be able to find what they're looking for. And I'm like,
Mhm.
to me, that would be a great sadness. So I just love the idea of keeping that continuity, as it were, going.
Mhm. Yeah, like they know that there's hundred like I want to say there's over 100,000, it might be 150,000 books that they know were created, but they also know that no copy exists.
Hmm.
And in many cases, these were like throwaway books. These were, penny dreadfuls or like, what
Hmm.
have you. Um, but that's terrifying to me.
Yeah, me too.
you know, like that's scary, and I don't want that to happen to my lovely comics.
No, because there's so much of value here beyond the covers, and the covers are great. But I do feel that sometimes in comics there's a penchant to focus cover forward and not
Hmm.
always on what's in between them. So and also I love seeing the old letters columns and those kind of things. I think those
Hmm.
things are incredibly important because then you get to really get into the headspace of what people were thinking and saying. And I love reading those because when you read them, you see that, people aren't so different. Really, like lots
Yes.
of the things they're complaining about, lots of their concerns and questions, the sass back and forth, even though it's less immediate, it's all
Hmm.
still there.
I love the adverts.
Mm.
Like that's probably one of my favorite ones. On the back of Suspense Comics #3, which is the most valuable non-Marvel, non-DC comic in the world,
Mhm.
there's like on the front cover, there's a woman ready to be burned alive with Nazi KKK members, and a man
Mhm.
valiantly trying to save her. And on the back, there's an advert for how to write better love letters. I'm like, yeah, that's perfect. Like that works for me.
You're covering all your bases.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, there was another interesting one that we were just working on the other day. And on the back, it basically had like corset ads.
Mm.
And to me, that was really interesting because nobody's going to spend for advertising unless they
Mhm.
think that there's a chance that they're going to hit the demographic that they want to hit.
Mhm.
And so, historically, we always believed that comic books were mostly for boys. And a corset advert on the back of a comic book lets you know that they thought that there were going to be a decent number of girls or slash women reading that comic book that
Mhm.
might reach out to buy their product. And I'm like, that's something that we don't really know about today. We just assume it was all boys.
No, it's really interesting because I get the same response when I talk about Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane and like how well, like how big, like how much it sold and everything. I'm like, no, it also
Hmm.
like had a significant female base, but so did lots of the others. And that just
Hmm.
doesn't get talked about. And same with some of the creators. I like to go and research and see if you can see who wrote it. And, because
Yeah.
sometimes that can be difficult. Sometimes because it's just not there. Sometimes maybe because they didn't want anybody to know that they wrote it.
Yeah. All of these things. Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, and like there were some women that were really integral to comics,
Hmm.
as far back as the 1950s and 1940s. We just don't talk about them a lot, which is a little bit
Hmm.
unfortunate. Like EC Comics, the to me the coloring of EC Comics was probably about a decade ahead of its time. Like when you look at an EC comic book from like 1952 and you
Hmm.
compare that to, for instance, a DC or Marvel comic from 1952, one looks like it was drawn 10, 20 years later.
Hmm.
And that's because that they had a real dedication to that, and it was run by like and the coloring was really pushed forward by a woman. And
Hmm.
that's very important, and we wouldn't have comic books today that look the way that they did if it wasn't for that bridge of EC. And I feel the same way about Punch, and I feel the same way about Chamber of Chills. And there's so many examples where if this didn't get made, we wouldn't have what we have today.
Hmm.
And that might sound like a grandiose statement, but I believe it all helps build the future. And so to look at that is cool
Hmm.
because it's the origination point.
Yeah, and to move to what we have now, because I'm like, comics are still cool. And like, there's still
Mhm.
so many fun, amazing innovations happening. So it's not about, put pedestaling one era over the other, anything like that. It's just about kind of sharing the entire tapestry of everything, that there's value in all of it, basically.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And we need to take the positives from it and not eschew the negatives. Like, you know, the negatives can be pretty severe.
Yes.
Definitely we legitimately have conversations about what should we print and what should we not print, because a lot of this product was of its time, and you know, it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to create it today.
So where did you land on that? Did you just decide to leave it as was, or?
Yeah, so for us, it's important to represent history the way it happened. And honestly, a large part of that was I didn't want to recreate something in a way that you could say, oh, it never really happened and it wasn't really a big deal or anything like that. Like, these are important things, you know, to note that happened historically. But we can also say this already exists in the world, you know. So we're not doing something brand new that is, you know, offensive for offensive's sake. Again, a great example is the Suspense comics #3 with Nazi, you know, imagery on it and KKK imagery on it. That's provocative, you know, but of its time, 1945, it's incredibly relevant. So probably not a cover that I would create today, but in 1945, when you add historical context, it makes perfect sense.
I know not everybody agrees with keeping everything as is. I personally am an as is person because I think it is important, because without the as is element, you fall sometimes into like source trust me, bro, which is never a place that like I want to be. It's like, it was bad, trust me, bro. Or like, it was good, trust me, bro. I'm like, no, I want to know like for myself. And it's like you were saying, it's not about, you know, like highlighting, showcasing, or like trying to like grandize any of those things, but just like, this is what it was. And if you want to experience it, then it's there, you know, and to see what it was like, you know?
Yeah. And if you were to recreate this stuff for a more modern day audience, you can then make that decision of what to include and what to exclude, because it becomes a new product. But if we're being, if we're honoring the original, then we can't alter it, or else we're not doing our job. Yeah.
What did you find though, in terms of, because I know some people feel like there's a lot of that kind of material in the older stuff. Did you find that there was a lot, more than people would expect, less than people would expect?
I think that there's probably less than what people expect. And it's another one of the reasons why I want to keep the stuff in there is you can see it altering in real time as well.
As it moves. Yeah.
Like there's on another series, and I won't go into details because I, of course, want people to buy the Kickstarter and to see for themselves. But there's one issue that was fairly problematic. And it was like a single issue, you know, with a single character that was, you know, a fairly racist trope. And the next issue, they got rid of it because it didn't work and it wasn't authentic. And so to me, if I eschew the original issue, you don't get to see that real time, and you don't get to see the publisher react in real time and go, oh, this wasn't a good idea. Let me take this person out, which to me is a case of it all working the way that it should work, you know? And so leaving that in allows you to see, you know, kind of like a very quick, very, you know, sudden evolution to kind of, you know, more middle ground, as opposed to, you know, a more racist leaning area. So I love that.
Did you find that there was anything else as you were going through that like changed quicker than you thought it would in terms of like style, tone, theme, or anything?
There are books, and this is more kind of like a general statement, but there are books where it's painfully obvious the time period that it was written in. Like, you know, there's certain slang, and it really feels like it's like a parent trying to use slang that a kid would use. Like, it feels cringy when I read it. But there's stories where I'm like, this could have been published today and I would have read it and I would have loved it. And so that's interesting to me, how it's not a sudden change versus slow change, but it's amazing how some of it's timeless and some of it is like, there was never a time for this.
It's going to be interesting to see where lots of the comics of the now land with that too. Like sometimes it's fun to predict. Like when you see like slang and stuff pop up, you're like, if I read this in 20 years, how is
Mhm.
this going to be?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a really tough thing, like, especially as we, I created a number of Disney comics for
Mhm.
Disney under licensing agreements and with Disney themselves. And, as a middle-aged white man, creating a Frozen comic is difficult. And you really do have to figure out how to write for your audience in an authentic way as opposed to force it.
Mhm.
People who get it and people who don't. I always love like reading Silver Age Marvel stories because they really do feel kind of like of the time and important. And then when I read Silver Age DC stories with like there's a character called Snapper Carr,
Oh,
and
yes,
he's
yes.
like the Justice League mascot, and I'm like
Yes.
so cringy, of the time. I'm like, how is it like, they were written in the same time period? How does
I
one feel
always
authentic and the other feel just, oh, terrible?
I always feel a bit bad for that period of Silver Age DC because I'm like DC has so much more scrutiny on it than Marvel does
Hmm.
because so much of the code and the hearings and stuff is focused on some of their stuff, and then
Hmm.
their Marvel comes with this little rebrand and is like, "Hi, we're Marvel now," and so
Hmm.
they get to deal with things a bit differently. And I also think because of that they also get to focus a bit differently with
Yeah.
creating new characters and new things, whereas DC is still going with its like new Silver Age like versions and also the older Golden Age, but now kind of also
Hmm.
Silver Age because they've got slightly different backstories and stuff. Snapper,
Yeah.
I think, gets better when he betrays the Justice League. I mean, what?
Fair. And I love me a good like DC Silver Age comic book. I especially love the Supergirl comics. I think that they were,
Same.
amazing, every single one. And then again, they go into Fever Dreams where like her horse
Mhm.
is actually a centaur that was changed. Do you know this?
Yeah, Comet.
Yeah. And I'm like, what?
And he was in love with her, and it was just like a whole
And he
thing.
decided to stay a horse. And I'm like, I I think this is problematic. I think this is interspecies romance, and I don't know that I'm okay with it, for young girl comics. But again, just sometimes you roll with it.
Mhm. Well, I don't want to take too much of your time, and I want to make
Sure.
sure that I can get this up so that we can get it during the campaign so that everybody
Great.
can check it
Great.
out and all of those good things. But I want to thank you so much for taking some time to talk about all of this and the process and what's coming. And I think it's really exciting. And is there anything else you want to highlight for everybody?
Just, something that I didn't mention is it's
Mhm.
all actually retaining the exact same dimensions,
Oh,
which
nice.
is both a blessing and a curse. So, you will actually get different size trims and everything of the comic books. But again, we just wanted to like keep it authentic. It's the goal for us was if you went into a store in the 1940s or 1950s and you picked a book off the shelf, it would feel the exact same way that our book feels today in
Mhm.
your hands, you know?
Mhm.
So that's the only thing that I don't think that we really highlighted upon.
Mhm. Well, hopefully people get the chance to check that out. So I will
Please
put
do.
all of the links and all of that good stuff down below. And thanks again to Adam for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much to everyone who made it to the end. If you're interested, please do check out the Kickstarter down below. You can get your hands on some very cool horror comics. I'm definitely looking forward to getting the Frightful 15. Thanks again to Adam for stopping to discuss the project. And as always, I will have more videos for all of you soon. And I'll see you then. Bye bye.